Inclusivity and Exclusivity. I take great pleasure in welcoming all the panel members and the moderator. And I also welcome Shri Kavita ma'am. I thank her for all the support in helping us to make this event possible. Thank you. We will begin the session now. I call upon Dr. Swapna ma'am to begin the session.
Thank you so much, Priya. Good evening to all of you. Priya, how many minutes do each one of us get for a quick presentation?
15 to 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Priya. Okay, now I think one thing that before I begin that I want to tell the department is that the topic that you have chosen for the panel discussion is extremely good, particularly which speaks about inclusivity and the inclusion part of the gender is something that very rarely that we come by, specifically where they are dealing with this. And incidentally, it also happens that this year onwards, in the School of Law, this in fact is an elective which we have started in the School of Law, which specifically deals with gender diversity and inclusivity is what we are looking at. Now, as we begin to speak about inclusivity, now one thing that I very clearly get in my mind is that now there are two words that we so often use. We speak about diversity and then we speak about inclusivity. So are these two things same, and can you use it synonymously and interchangeably? Now, when you're speaking about diversity and when we're specifically speaking about gender diversity, now today I'm given here to understand that gender diversity, gender basically refers to any gender. It could not only refer to the binary gender, but it could also refer to the third gender when you're looking at gender inclusivity. But what I will do specifically is that I'm going to specifically look only at women as gender, and I'm not going to extend any of my talk relating to the other gender. So when I speak about gender, I'm going to specifically look at women as a gender. So this is one thing that I wanted to make it pretty much clear even before I started with this small session. So that is one thing. Now, another thing is that, we were looking at diversity and inclusivity. So are these two things one and the same? So the first thing is that diversity and inclusivity do go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin, but they're not same. You could not interchange it. You could not use it synonymously. Now, for example, what does diversity mean? Now, diversity means that I will be able to have more representation of women in my organization. I'm going to get more women on board. I'm going to have more women sitting at the management. I'm going to be having more women in the leadership. This is what is the meaning of the term diversity. Now, like I told you, I'm speaking about women, but it could mean maybe I'm going to have the third gender also. I'm going to have a person who's differently able to be a part of it. So these are the different kinds of diversities that I'm looking at. Now, what does inclusivity mean and what is the meaning of inclusion? Now, having brought these people on board, having brought them into your fold, how far are you actually making them comfortable with respect to giving their best, with respect to having their choices in life? With respect to making them take up the best choice that they want. So these are two different things. So one is diversity and another is inclusivity. So in diversity, you're actually bringing in people into this fold. They may be people with different abilities. They may be people of third gender. They could be marginalized people, or in other countries, like they say, they could be blacks. There could be different diversities of people. But once you get them onto your fold, what exactly are you doing them to make them comfortable is what we speak about in terms of inclusivity. Now let's understand this inclusivity is important, of course, for the fairness of the society. This inclusivity is a very important thing for the organization itself. It is important for the society also. But as a lawyer, I'm also very keen to share with you this inclusivity is not something that ends at the social part of it. It is not something that ends only at the economic part of it, but it is something which has a very stringent legal binding. Now, that is precisely where I'm coming from when I'm looking at inclusivity. Now, having said that, now what we are trying to speak about in terms of inclusivity, now particularly if you're looking at it from the legalistic perspective, is that now, say for example, there are many laws which give it a legal binding. Now, the first thing that I would like to flag here is about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came into force in 1948. Now, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is an international convention. And this Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not come just like that. Just, it did not just appear in a day. It did not take its birth just like that randomly. But Universal Declaration of Human Rights was such a milestone in human rights. The reason was because it came about after a lot of struggle, lot of revolutions, and almost after people had learnt their lessons. Now, this came in the aftermath of the Second World War. So just look at the year, it is 1948. So it came in the aftermath of the Second World War, when people began to realize that we have had devastating effects and therefore we should be concerned about human rights. Now, the first and the foremost article, that is Article 1 of the UDHR 1948, it gives out a very simple proposal. It gives out a very simple provision which states that all will be treated equally, irrespective of their rank, their caste, creed, nationality, or gender. So just look at it, for something as simple as that to be an opening statement. Did we require to have so much of struggle? Did we require to have so much of revolution? Now the point is, yes, the reason is because even something which appears to be idealistically, this is how it has to be, even something that appears to be so seemingly simple is not there in the world. That is the reason why we are speaking about inclusivity. That is the reason why we are being mindful of the fact that we do not have it, and therefore we require platforms like that to speak about inclusion, to be very mindful and say that inclusion should be there very consciously. Now, let me just very quickly tell you about the laws which speaks about inclusion. So do we have inclusion as law? Yes. So the first one I was telling you was about UDHR. UDHR might not have a legal binding, but nevertheless, it's a very important document. It's a very important part of the public opinion creating document. So that is one thing. Now, another thing which I'm sure all of you will be familiar with, and you should have heard it somewhere, is about the CEDAW. Now, CEDAW is another important international convention. What CEDAW stands for is Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Now, this also is a very important international convention which speaks about how violence against women, how any kind of abuse against women, bias against women, discrimination against women will have to be suppressed, will have to be dealt with, and it will have to be taken care of. Now, CEDAW is a very important international convention which speaks about human rights, which speaks about gender justice, and from there, it also speaks about inclusion. Now, when it says that women will not be violated against, women cannot be abused, you cannot violate the dignity of a woman, you cannot violate the person of a woman, what it is basically giving her is that it is giving her that security to work on par with a man, and that's a very important thing. Because understand, you could not give women the right to work, and when she comes to work, you could not have an organization which does not respect her. You could not have an organization which does not, respect her dignity or her person. So it is very important that when you speak about inclusivity, you also speak about that kind of an atmosphere, that kind of an environment which supports that, which promotes that, and say that I have given you all these, but I'm also making the environment conducive to you. So that is precisely what we mean when we are speaking about inclusivity. So inclusivity does not just mean that I have this percentage of women in my organization, I have this percentage of women in my workplace. the percentage of women in my workplace are much larger than the men. No, you're not proving anything there if you do that. It is very important, having been brought them into the fold, having included them into the fold, are you really doing something to allow them to have their choices, to allow them to have a full life, just like the way their male counterparts would do? So, how is this atmosphere getting created? Does law help in this regard? Absolutely. Now, let us see what law does and what are the different laws that we have which is aligned towards this kind of an objective. The first one is, of course, the Companies Act. And I'm sure all of you have heard about the Companies Act, isn't it? If you need to incorporate a company, you have the Indian Companies Act. Now, it was in 2014, through an amendment, the Companies Act decided that there will be representation of women in the boardroom. There's going to be representation of women as directors in the company. And they made it mandatory for the first time through an amendment in 2014, where they said that you need to have a company, then you need to have one woman director. Of course, even there, the organizations try to circumvent, they try to beat around the bush. You have these legal concepts like independent directors and other directors, so where they were trying to beat around the bush. But of course, what we need to appreciate is that from the legal point of view, efforts were done. Realizations did happen. Now, how it is going to work out is a different thing altogether. Following suit about the amendment of the company law, the another act which came about was what we call as the SEBI, okay, that is Securities and Exchange Board of India, in 2015 again made it mandatory, saying that we need to see one woman on board. So that is how they promoted representation of women. By law, they saw that, they made it a mandate, they made it compulsory that you need to have women representation. And of course, just like the way that you're all aware, 33% of representation is there in the political arena too. In the panchayat, you have 33% of women who are to be given the seats. So that's another very important thing that has come about. Now, apart from this, you also have other laws. There are so many laws which actually support this. But the base document, which is very important, where we need to make a mention, which is not just for law students, but I think for everybody, is that all of us have our constitutional rights. All of us have our fundamental rights. And one of the most important fundamental rights that the Constitution of India gives to all of us is that the right to equality and the right not to be discriminated, which is given in Article 14 and Article 15 of the Constitution, which is a very important constitutional guarantee. So one speaks about equality in a very positive term. The other speaks about the duty that is enjoined, where you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender. By discriminating on the basis of gender, by creating bias on the basis of gender, what do? You don't make environment right for a woman to participate. And when you don't make the environment right for a woman to participate, where is the question of inclusivity? All the arguments about inclusivity, all the speeches about inclusivity will just remain paper tiger. Similarly, you have the Maternity Benefit Act, you have the Sexual Harassment Act, you have so many provisions in CRPC. Say, for example, you have the Dowry Prohibition Act. So like that, you have so many acts, or, Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act. You have so many acts which are pro-women, which are specifically given for women, where the legal framework says that women will need to be protected. You need to have certain rights. You need to give them very important laws. And this is to see that they are protected and made secure in the society. Now, having told you about what are the laws, which is pro women or which is gender specific. Now, I want to share with you 4 very important cases. Now, these 4 cases are very close to my heart because they speak about the rights which is given to women, and I'm sure you'll all find it extremely interesting. Now, I'll just tell you about one case. The year was 1982, and this was a case which concerned Air India. Now you understand that that was the time when Air India was a major flyer, because the flights were not privatized as such. Now during this time, can you believe Air India had one clause in their employment contract, and this clause read something like this. It said women who joined as air hostess in Air India had to retire. Three clauses. The first clause says, in the event of her marriage, in the event of first pregnancy, or if she attained 45 years of age. Now, whichever is the earliest, the woman would have to retire, as against 58 years, which was given to a man. So this was not even, I'm not even looking at it like 18th century. I'm looking at it in 1982, after we had got independence. Many decades had passed after independence, and a provision like that in Air India remained like this. This matter went before the Supreme Court, and in the Supreme Court, this provision was struck down as unconstitutional because they said this is such a gross and apparent violation of gender equality. How can you expect any kind of gender justice when you're saying that a woman and a man who are equally situated, they are at par with each other, maybe because of their competency, because of their qualification, and then you say that a man can work till 58 years and a woman will have to retire at 45 years. What is it that you're trying to look at? If a woman is married, you make the decision that she's not able to work. If a woman is going to have a child, you make a decision that she's not able to give enough to the workplace. So therefore, the law said, we are going to strike it down as unconstitutional. I will tell you one more case which is extremely interesting. Now, this is a case which happened in Kerala, and this was a decision of the Kerala High Court. Though I forget which is the case name, I can always pull it out and give it to you sometime. But this is what happens in this case. Now, this relates to the Electricity Board of Kerala, and they were calling in applications for linemen. Linemen have this thing that they will have to go up the pole and they will have to repair and things like that. So they were calling in applications. Now, what happened was that now they had not thought that women could actually apply for it or women would apply for it. But it so happens that in this particular case, one woman applies for it and then she's not given the job. The reason was because they said this will require climbing up the pole. A woman will not be able to do that, maybe because she's not used to it or because of the attire of the sari. You cannot start climbing up the pole, and therefore you are not eligible for this job. This matter also went to the High Court of Kerala, and in the High Court of Kerala, in such a beautiful way, the judiciary remarks, you're right, woman might not be able to climb the pole, either because she's wearing a sari or she feels she's not used to that kind of thing, or she might feel a little embarrassed about how she's going to start climbing and people are going to start looking at her. But have you heard of something called ladders? Okay, so they said, have you heard of something called ladder? Do you have to start climbing the pole? Can't you use a ladder and can't you climb up the ladder like a stairs? Why do you require to climb up the pole? Maybe it used to be there at one point of time, but it doesn't mean that every time you have to start climbing up the pole like that. So very beautifully and in such a beautiful way, the High Court said, High Court of Kerala said, no, you have heard of ladders, you have heard of mobile ladders. So why don't you get that? And just on this basis that a woman is not able to climb a tree, don't deny her the opportunity. So denial of employment opportunity, whether because night shift is required, whether it requires hard work, or whether it is insecure, this is the responsibility of the state to take care. If a woman is working in the night shift, then you provide adequate security. That is precisely what the Karnataka government also did some time back. So like that, they said, this is how you have to look at gender justice. This is how you have to look at equality. And this is when you can allow women to get into the fold and to make them work. So that is how this thing was decided. Now, again, to tell you another very important thing, a very important case for us lawyers is called Vinita Sharma versus Rakesh Sharma. The reason why this case is important is because now this was a case which, set a landmark, which set a very important milestone, particularly under the Hindu law for Hindus, where, see, till now, we have this concept which is called co-partners. Okay. Now, till now, it is only the sons who can be co-partners who will have the right to the ancestral property. A woman will never have the right to ancestral property because she's never considered to be a co-partner. But in this case, a very recent case, the Supreme Court said, no, a woman is on par with a man. She will also have the co-partnery right. She will also have the right in the ancestral property. So what happens when you do these kinds of things? You're actually opening the doors for inclusivity. You're trying to tell her, yes, you are not different from my son. You are not different from your brother, but you are on same plane. Now you can come and do as much as you can, and then you give it your best. See, these are the soft parts of inclusivity, which is required if you need to speak about inclusivity in the effective way and in the real way. And let us, of course, not forget that the very famous triple talaq case. Now, what also happened in the Shayara Banu versus Union of India? Now, talaq-e-bidat, I'm sure all of you must have heard and read so much about, where 3 times pronouncement of the talaq, a woman would get talaq and she's left destitute. Now, what happens to this poor lady? She has spent her time, she has spent her efforts, must have sacrificed so much, and suddenly a man decides that talaq, 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 and then she's just put up on the road. Now, what happens to her? Now, this also was held to be unconstitutional. Or say, for example, the Shabrimala case. There also entry into the temple, where the Supreme Court came very heavily and said, no, you cannot do this, you cannot ban. And the menstruation of a woman is her biological need, is a part of what nature has given her, and nobody can declare it unholy, or nobody can declare it to be dirty or unclean or whatever it is. So like that, many a times there has been the judiciary which has given solid help, where judiciary has said that gender justice will have to be prevailed. The reason why we spoke about all these things is to bring to fore and tell that you have laws, there is judiciary, but what woman requires is to know about these things, is to have access to this important information. And I feel that is when you can have effective inclusivity. Otherwise, inclusivity is just going to remain on paper. You can get somebody, you can put them on, and then you can tell them that, okay, you're not entitled to maternity benefit. You want, you work, you don't want, you don't work. That is not the way it has to happen. The most important empowerment for a woman, capacity building for a woman will happen only if she has access to all these information. And with this, I want to now pass it on to Priya. So this is what I wanted to share with you. So thank you so much. Priya, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. It was very wonderful. I request the moderator, Sudiksha, to take over.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sapna, for this illuminating presentation. I'm sure we all learned a lot from that. So for those of you who just listened, Dr. Sapna heads the School of Law at Christ University and has been doing so since 2019. She holds a PhD from the prestigious National Law School of India. And her research mainly focuses on employment laws from a gender perspective. And she also is a consultant with the Department of Labor on gender capacity building with the government of Karnataka, and is on the board of the National Commission for Women. So yeah, thank you, ma'am. Moving on, I now invite Dr. Ananya Sinha, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Christ University and is a licensed clinical psychologist. An NET and SCT qualified senior research fellow. She pursued her PhD from the Department of Clinical Psychology in NIMHANS, and also is an international affiliate member of the American Psychological Association. And her areas of interest include ethical practices in psychotherapy and counseling, gender studies, cognitive and emotional processing of traumatic events, LGBT issues, and borderline personality disorder. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sudiksha, and thank you, for giving me an opportunity to talk about something which is so close to my heart. I also would like to thank Dr. Sapna for initiating the conversation so beautifully and bringing in so many important points. So when I was given this opportunity to actually speak about it, I was for a very long time trying to understand what exactly would I like to communicate through this platform. I think one of the major things that I felt was, why are we even talking about gender inclusivity? Why is it that despite being part of the 21st century, there is a need to talk about gender inclusivity? So, like Dr. Sapna was pointing out that everyone should be able to exercise their human rights, yet um, getting that thing about human rights being passed was so difficult. So we know that we belong to a society where basic rights are often difficult to achieve. We also understood from Dr. Sapna's presentation one thing, that things are on paper are probably not enough, and we need to go beyond what is on paper. So yes, there are fortunately many inclusivity policies and laws now. However, if we really want to practice inclusivity, it has to go beyond the words. It has to be here somewhere, that we internalize what is inclusivity. So I am, as you have probably noticed, that I am a person who has worked with the LGBTQ community as well. So for me, whenever I talk about gender, it's difficult to limit myself only to male and female, because gender is like the third gender is as much as an acceptable gender as is the male and female gender. So I thought I'll probably share some of my experiences of working with the third gender. And then I would like to draw some parallels of how, in general, this entire discrimination is in terms of with women. Is it really different when it comes to the third gender, or the struggle is similar? How are we as a society? So I was doing my master's dissertation, and I very strongly remember that when I went up to my guy, and that was, of course, you can imagine, master's, so it was long, long years back. So I went up to my guide, who was quite an aged, elderly male supervisor. And when I told him that, I want to work with transgenders, I remember the first thing that he said, that, are you sure? Why on earth would you like to work with transgenders? And I was like, I'm intrigued. I would like to know more about them. And he was like, okay, first you go and take permission from your parents. If they are okay, then probably we can work on it. Okay, so that was quite, that was not something that was expected. And it made me think a lot, that if my supervisor is not very sure and is asking, like, why do I need to work in this area? There are so many other areas. What kind of experience do these people have in general in the society? Because we are part of the mental health community. We are trained to be non-judgmental. We are trained to have unconditional positive regard. Yet we have these strongly held values. So I went to my parents, and it was not easy, if I may put it briefly. It was not easy to convince them. So their response was also like, why would you like to work with transgenders? Like, you are in the clinical psychology department, you can work with any other psychological distress, psychological disorder. Why transgenders? So this kind of response also made me think that psychological disorder still acceptable, although we are talking about a time which is like pretty, like almost 13, 14 years back or more than that. Yet there was a lot of stigma about psychology. People were not talking about mental health the way we are doing now. But still in their mind, psychological disorder, fine. But why the third gender? However, finally, when I could convince them that, yes, this is what I would like to work on, I went to some of the organizations where there were people who were part of the transgender community, the transsexual community. And I said that this is my research, this is what I would like to do. So they just made me sit down and they said that, you know what, we'll talk about your research. We'll talk about your research at length. But before that, we need to be convinced about certain things. I was like, what? They said that, you know, we have a condition. If you really want to research about us, you need to spend a day with us. An entire day, it has to be with us. It's like, okay, that's not a big deal. And they were like, that means that you are going to go to our houses, you're going to go to all the places that we are going, you're going to have food with us, you're just going to sit around and be with us. And I sort of agreed because at that time, I did not really think through a lot. To me, it was more of a condition for getting my research done. And I was like, okay, I'm fine with it. So we started by our day by them showing me a few videos that they had made about their lives. There they have told in their own way, they've narrated the kind of discrimination they have experienced in their lives. Each one had a small video about themselves. So they just showed me a few, just to give me an idea what their background is, what kind of family they came from, what kind of experience they had had while growing up, and what had made them a part, like today they are saying that, okay, I am a transgender, but it was not an easy journey for them. So how was their journey? So just gave me a glimpse of it. After that, we sort of stepped out and they said, okay, we'll have lunch together. Where should we go for lunch? And I said, okay, I know a place near my house and we can just go there. I can vouch for the quality of food there. So let's go there and have food there. I remember that day when I stepped in, and this was one restaurant which I usually often go because this was a restaurant which was very close to my house and they knew me as a person. And I walked in with 4 or 5 members of the transgender community. And the person who's typically served me, an elderly person, and he just came and said, why are you with these people? What happened? And I was like, I just need a table, get me a table. And he again reiterated, are you with these people? Are you sure you just want to be with them and you want to have lunch with them? And I was like, yes, I do want to have. But all these small experiences were slowly making me feel what it is to be in their shoes. The final experience was, of course, after that, we went to their houses. I saw their living conditions and all. And then there is a place called Nandan in Calcutta. So I belong to Calcutta. And this is a place where typically people hang out. There's a movie theater there, and there are other, like, people just hang out with their friends, families, and you will find a lot of people there just walking, taking a walk, or just sitting in groups, people from all the age groups. So this time when I walked in, they said, so the members of the transgender community, they said that, you know what, you have to stand with us. Just stand with us. Don't stand away from us. Don't stand on the opposite side. Stand with us. That's all we want. That was not a big demand. But when I stood with them, that was for the first time I felt what it is to be a part of this community. The entire experience was like everyone was looking at us. So I became a part of their community. So the way they were looking at us, the way I could see people pointing, I could see people, probably it might be in my mind also, but maybe talking about us, it was a very first-hand experience of discrimination. And that was probably also the point where I felt how privileged I had been throughout. I had not experienced this level of discrimination ever. And there was nothing actually, like, you know, people were not coming and telling things to them. They were actually just standing in one corner and there were other people, but that you are different and we are different and your difference is not accepted was very clear in their tone. This experience definitely made me understand or rather experience discrimination from a very different lens. And this time the lens was just the lens of gender. There was nothing different. Their struggles, their emotions, everything was almost like, right, rather almost, everything was the same. The only thing that was different was the way they identified the gender. Now, coming from this discrimination, it is the thing of inclusivity. Do they really have access to education? How many of you have actually seen a transgendered person sitting with you in the same school, in the same bench, and you being comfortable with that? How many of you had actually experienced your parents talking about your friends, all of them, with what, like males and females and transgenders? So their inclusion part is more like, of course, access to workplace, access to education. And on the other hand, there's a social inclusion that we need to think about. And that social inclusion has a lot to do with how we perceive gender. Is gender not a basic human right? And when I'm saying gender, let me differentiate with the fact that there's a difference between sex and gender. Sex is basically the biological self. So biologically, how do I identify myself? But gender is more about the norms, or for example, I can be a female, like biologically I can be a female, yet I can identify with the gender role of a male. So there is a difference between sex and gender. Now this gender is a basic choice and a basic right. I can choose what I want to be identified as. Discrimination based on that choice, not having access to basic amenities based on that choice, is that a part of human rights? Maybe not. Or maybe something that we had started thinking pretty late, because discussion about gender neutrality is a very, very recent phenomenon. It is not, it's still a very uncomfortable topic of discussion when it comes to, even when you discuss with your parents or you just go and you talk about it, still it's a difficult topic. So what is inclusivity then? Inclusivity needs to start from the point that are we actually in a pedestal to include people somewhere? Everybody has a right to be included. Ideally, it should be an egalitarian society where everybody has equal rights. Reality is we are far from that, unfortunately. But at least individually, can we understand this thing? That inclusivity is not an ideal utopian concept. It is a very, very basic right, very basic thing that you can give to someone. I remember we had, there was a movie called Dahan, which is by National Award-winning director Rituparna Ghosh. So this was about a very different, the entire concept was very different, where there was one girl being molested and another girl went and protected her, like saved her. And everybody was actually hero worshipping the second girl who saved her. Now this girl had a grandmother, and when she went to the grandmother and she said that, you know, everybody is treating me so differently, I did this and I did that. So the grandmother very calmly said that I don't think I would like to appreciate you for what you did, because this is the basic human thing that you can do. You saved someone. I think this is what resonates with me when we talk about inclusivity. The entire discussion that we are having is very, very important and pertinent discussion, primarily to emphasize on the fact that these are basic human rights. We are, what Dr. Sapna mentioned, that there was so much of discussion on having these basic rights being acknowledged is a shame. And we can start from that point, that we understand that each one of us has equal rights. Now, where does this thing about not, why more than where does this thing come from, why do you think this inequality in the society or the discrimination in the society exists and is maintained? Probably because there is a concept of hegemony. In the society, there is some kind of imbalance already. It's lopsided. So the discussion about transgender is almost not part of the picture when it comes to gender. The other discussion, which is like thankfully people are talking about, is about rights of women. So there was a time where women were absolutely disregarded of their basic rights long time back, and there was a lot of struggle, and now we have reached a point where women are being inclusive. At least there are efforts to make women inclusive in the society in every form. But the majority is still that there is a hegemonic myth that men are more powerful, men are more capable of doing this job, and men will be able to handle it better. Now, where is this hegemonic myth being maintained, and why is it being maintained? That is where probably we need to look a little bit into the social psychology concept. So we have something called the social identity theory. So we have a personal identity, but beyond that, we have something as the social identity. And that social identity makes us a part of the in-group. So if I'm saying that I am a male, I'm part of the in-group of male, and everybody outside of that is an out-group. Similarly, if I'm a female, then the males and others will be an out-group. The problem begins when we try to protect that in-group qualities very stringently, where to the extent of being aggressive towards the out-group, and we probably end up harming or doing something derogatory towards the out-group. That is where the problem is. So we have to maintain. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
I think I got muted for some time. So in a bid to maintain that in-group stability or in-group characteristics, which is so much associated with your identity, and your identity is something that gives you a sense of self-worth and sense of living, you hold on to it strongly. Anything that is against it or that might threaten it, you oppose it. And you do everything else to maintain the other thing. On the contrary, there are these social learning theories which says that we are growing up. Let's not deny the fact that we are growing up in a patriarchal society. So we have not grown up learning to question these things. We observe that these are the rules, we follow that rules. It is only discussions like this, or maybe media has a very strong role to play, and maybe some other reading materials or anywhere where you get a different information, where people make you think and reflect on your beliefs. That is when you probably understand, okay, these are the things which I'm just following because it's a part of what I've learned. And these are the things which I'm following because I believe in it. So that is where your personal belief enters. So there are societal reasons or sociological, psychosocial reasons for which we maintain certain forms of inequality, discrimination, and even if we know what social justice is on paper, gender justice is on paper, we sometimes, when it comes to us, it becomes very difficult to understand that probably I am also not being that just when it comes to gender justice. Because we are not told and we are not trained that this is discrimination, this is inequality, this is excluding them, this is including them. But we are not trained in that. So probably the entire issue about inclusivity is about the fact that we feel that gender, there is certain rights or certain things that one gender can do better than other. One gender is more entitled to get than others. One gender is probably more, if I may use the term, more potent to get than others. That is where the problem is. So if we really want to be inclusive, we need to first start with ourselves. and ask ourselves that why is this need for inclusion? Why is there a discrimination? Why is it not equal? Because it is a basic right. And maybe once we find those answers, we will be able to uphold our beliefs well, and then probably we will be able to go and make changes in policies and at least have discussions about change in policies, and not only policy change, but we can probably ensure that these policy changes are being actually enacted into behaviors. So those are not being just limited to laws and policies, but we are enacting it. So I would like to conclude by saying that when it comes to gender inclusivity, we all have a role to play. Let's play our small, simple roles. Let's go look deep into our beliefs, our stereotypes, our prejudices, our biases, and then let's take a step forward to make this place and this society a more inclusive society. Thank you. Over to you, Subhiksha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ananya. This was extremely insightful. Moving on, I would like to invite Dr. Sushma V. Murthy, who is the Associate Professor of English at Christ University and teaches gender studies, post-colonial and world literatures, cultural studies, and British literature. She was affiliated to the University of Montreal under the Shastri Doctoral Research Fellowship and secured a doctoral degree in 2014 from the University of Mysore. Her research interests include queer theory and literature, feminist translation studies, psychoanalytical feminism, and trauma narratives by women. Her publications include research articles on feminist translation, transgender aesthetics, and queer theory. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Subhiksha. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Yeah. So I hope I'm also visible to all of you. Just a minute, I'll switch on a different light. Just give me a minute. Yeah, so I hope this is better. Yeah. So many thanks to the Department of Professional Studies for inviting me, for having me over in this very eclectic evening panel discussion. Thanks to Dr. Sapna and to Dr. Ananya Sinha for already, talking about a lot of things which are very close to my heart. So I was just thinking what I can bring to this panel when, Dr. Priya approached me earlier. And I thought, I should speak from my space, right, which is literature, which is writing, which is, processes of reading and the kind of texts that we create out of bodies, basically. So one of the important things that I have found in my history of negotiation with gender studies as a student, and at a very personal level as a woman, is the very, very, very narrow, approach that we have to gender in terms of women and feminism, right? I'm saying this because in spite of having a PhD in feminism, I'm saying this. I think to a large extent, feminism has left a lot of other discourses behind, and it has to a certain extent widened the gender divide. And I know that a lot of, maybe a ton of bricks will be thrown at me if I say this in a public forum, but I'm saying this because literature allows me to look at, a lot of other issues that are related to gender, right? So normally what happens is in academic, circles, especially whether you're doing law like Dr. Sapna or psychology, right, or, you're approaching gender through sociology. So we all, approach gender through our, disciplinary lenses. Okay. And what generally happens is because there is a long history of women's movements, women's theories, and the focus on gender has to a large extent, been in terms of discourses of gender. These could be theories, these could be laws, these could be movements, these could be empirical, research on women and women's equality to men, right? There is, a tendency to view gender from a feminist lens. And I completely agree with Dr. Ananya here when she said, when she says that, we need to look at, the gender spectrum. right? That is a very important space for me, and that is the space where I am, right, after having read all the first world feminist theorists and having come to feminism through a first world lens and having, taught gender, to my students from, a very different perspective at Christ University, and having had to, talk to them about their experiences and to read, for example, post-colonial literatures or teach post-colonial literatures and to look at women's experiences in India, right? And that is when you really understand that the questions of gender are not only questions of equality of women with men, right? But rather these are questions of intersectionality. I will come to this term a little later, because for me, the idea of inclusivity is all the more important because the idea of gender itself is intersectional. And because we are trained in these academic spaces and we are trained in very theoretical ways or conceptual ways to approach gender as either male or female, sex as male or female, or gender as feminine or masculine, or as man and woman, right? We tend to ignore the fact that gender is constituted at the interstices of various other identities, right? So to give myself as an example, right? So I'm not just Sushma. I'm called Sushma because I was born in a Hindu family. I was born into a certain caste. I belong to a certain urban background. I have a certain educational background, which is why I'm sitting in front of you. And I come from a space of privilege largely, right? And that has given me access to a lot of, discourses of gender, which probably, the maid who comes home to, help us out in the mornings does not have, right? But both of us are experiencing gender as women, right? She is experiencing the, her own identity as a woman, primarily in terms of her body, right? Secondly, in terms of the social roles that she plays within her, different institutions. It could be her family, it could be her role within the corpus of marriage that she is bound to, right? It could be in relation to her children as a mother. Okay, so the same thing is true of me, right? And Dr. Sapna also pointed out this, that we have these, relationships with our institutions, the institutions that we belong to, the people whom we work with, right? And the idea that women are part of the public sphere now, and that the inequalities come from the public sphere also, as much as they come from the, domestic space. Right. So the idea that gender is something that is isolated, that gender is something that exists in itself, as itself, by itself, is something that I began to question, largely not through the Western feminisms that I was trained to, be exposed to or talk about as a PG student, as an MA student. Probably if you had asked me the definition of feminism, I would have told you that feminism is equality of women with men, or equality of both genders, right? But it is not just that which, constitutes gender. So I cannot separate gender from caste. I cannot separate questions of gender from race. I cannot separate questions of gender from nationalism, nationhood, right? Citizenship today in India. Right? And this is true for women of all countries. This is true of women coming from all backgrounds. Okay. So literature is one domain that helps you to look at gender primarily as a human experience, right? As an existential, experience. The idea that we are all made up of matter on the one hand, which is the body, but your body is ideologically mapped on. Your body is ideologically conditioned by the discourses that engage with the body. So you see the health industry has a certain narrative about your body. The reproductive industry has a certain narrative, right? Similarly, you see your spas, your leisure industries, your recreational industries, right? There are different industries who are watching your body, mapping your body, conditioning your body at the same time. Okay, which means that at the end of the day, your body is at the interstices of these various experiences. Okay, so before I become too theoretical, let me just backtrack a little and come back to what I was saying. So the idea that we cannot isolate gender, right, from these other aspects of your identity. It does not matter whether we are talking about a man or a woman, right? Whether we are talking about a biological man, right, or we are talking about a trans man. Okay. And there is a difference in that. All of us are bound with certain experiences, certain phenomena, right, which condition our identities based on the other aspects of our identity. Okay. And that is the reason why we realize that what constitutes our gender right, is not just a sex alone or the body into which you're supposedly born, right? Because sex is also a construct. I will not go into that now, but the fact that distinguish between bodies as male or female, right, is in itself an ideological, displacement, right? Because majority of us recognize certain forms of sexual characteristics as male and certain characteristics as female, right? Is not to say that there aren't other bodies, right? There aren't bodies which are neither male nor female. Okay, in fact, you have as much sexual diversity as you have gender diversity. Okay, so irrespective of which gender or which sexual orientation you're coming from, what biological sex you embrace or question or change, okay, what is very important for us to recognize that questions of gender, especially in India, especially in South Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, have been questions of the intersectionality of gender with other aspects of your identity. Okay, so which means that as for example, right, if I'm a Brahmin woman, right, you might say I'm privileged, right? But within my own community, in relation to the men in my family, in relation to the men in my community, in relation to the men in my religion, right, who take it upon themselves to interpret religion for us, right, I might be an oppressed individual. So intersectionality allows you to think of two things, right? One is that all of us are basically at the interstices of identity, right? Secondly, that you can be privileged and oppressed at the same time. And I think this is very important for us to understand, right? Because this allows us to think of, gender beyond the feminist frameworks or beyond the feminist approaches that we have known. And let me give you an example for that, right? So when we normally think of men, we think of patriarchy, right? We think of the male, right, as the oppressor, right? So we think of men as people of privilege, right? And that, we are trying to be equal to them, right? But if you actually look at the whole constitution of masculinity, you will realize that men are as much conditioned to perform their gender as much as women are, and in very different ways, right? And they really do not have a popular register, right, or a vocabulary or a language for masculinity as much as we have, right? And that is not to say that, we need to address gender, right, merely from the women's point of view. So if you are able to look at intersectionality, then you will realize that men and women are at the interstices of various identities that they embody, right? It could be your caste, it could be religion, race, nationalism, nationality, citizenship. It could be your ethnicity, your indigeneity. Suppose you belong to a tribe, right? Your indigenous identity has a lot to do with how you're perceived as a man or a woman, right? So similarly, your age, your ability or disability, if you want to call it that within quotes, all of these become very important aspects of your gender, and you cannot separate one from the other. And that is the reason why, if you look at, for example, the history of feminism in India, the history of feminism in India is to a large extent the history of women of caste, women of color, right? There is a lot of Dalit feminism that, you look at. There is a lot of post-colonial feminism, right, that you look at when you look at writers like Mahashweta Devi, who have questioned the idea of, right, women's, role as citizens in a post-colonial world after independence. So what were the, what positions did women, tribal women occupy, say, during the Naxalbari movement, where they were, forced into, oppression by institutionalized forms of violence, where they were raped by the police, where they were raped by the army, which was supposed to protect them, for instance. Okay. So similarly, right, you see, you will look at concerns of gender from an intersectional lens, and that is when you realize that gender is a dialogue. And when we talk about inclusivity, the first step that we need to do, right, ideologically, is to include the men, right? If you are a feminist, you have to include the man, right? You have to talk about the men. You have to talk about their institutional roles. And why is it that there is so much of toxic masculinity around? Where does it come from? Without talking about hegemonic masculinity, you will not be able to, answer questions of gender inequality. So gender inequality is not just a women's question, right? It is a question that we need to articulate across the gender spectrum. Okay, so recently, right, you have had various instances where people have questioned the idea of menstruation. Okay, so it is very easy for us to think of a menstruation as a process that women undergo. And how do we qualify women? How do we define women? We define women as beings who are born into a biologically female body, right? And this is the first step that you need to take to move away from these stereotypes which don't allow you an inclusive dialogue or an inclusive space, right? So if it is completely possible that you're trans male to female, right, and you are menstruating. It is possible that you're trans female to male, right, and you are still menstruating, right? So when we look at questions of menstruation, do we include trans men and trans women, for example? Do we include intersex adults, for example? Okay, so that is one question that I want to leave you with. The second question is, when we look at discourses of rape, right, do we look at rape away from the very binary approach that we have, as in terms of women as victims and men as oppressors, right? What is rape and what kind of an act is rape, right? So it's important to look at why there is a lot of institutionalization of violence, and why are men, right, conditioned to be aggressive? Where is the aggression coming from, right? Why do rapes happen? Why is there so much of child sexual abuse? Okay, so is it possible for us to look at rape in terms of a dialogue with men, instead of looking at the crime itself? Instead of doing that, can we possibly look at having a dialogue with men? Is it possible for us to, for example, to talk to people who have committed rapes, right? So there is this very interesting book. It's called The South of Forgiveness. Okay, and it is a book where a woman who was raped by her boyfriend when she was a young adolescent girl, right? When she was dating this boy, she was taken violently by him. She was raped. Okay, and then of course they part ways, and then she grows up to be a woman, and then of course she marries. She has her own children. So one fine day she sets out, to find this man and to go back to him and to talk to him, to have a dialogue with him, and to find out why he raped her, right? And to me, I mean, this kind of literature is very important because it allows you to open questions of gender across the genders and across the not just the binary, right? The first thing that you do when you allow masculinities into the gender dialogue is you break the binary, right? And that is one attempt to break the binary. And the next thing that you do is, right, you go beyond the very, very stereotypical understanding of gender in terms of male and masculine, man and woman, right? Male and female, masculine and feminine. So you see, is it possible for you to look at gender in terms of the performance, right? To borrow a term from Judith Butler, right? Gender is basically performance. And your performance has a lot to do with the intersectionality of your identity with various political, socio-economic, socio-psychological, like Dr. Ananya said. So there are a lot of things that go into making you the woman or the man, or whatever identity that you embody, right? So, it could be possible that your sex is more pronounced than your gender. It could be possible that you have questioned the binary of sex and gender through sexuality, right? So we have as many queer identities, right, as we have genders, right? And we have as many sexualities as we have individuals, right? Which means to say that, the so-called supposedly straight people are also queer, right? Because we are also performing our gender to a large extent, right? So it's very, very important that we open the, dialogue of gender beyond feminism to questions of masculinity, to questions of the gender spectrum, right, to questions of intersectionality, which brings me to the next point that I wanted to talk about, which is the idea of dialogue, the dialogic, right? So as long as we keep looking at the binary, to a large extent, we are caught up in a dialectic. So a dialectic approach is an approach which helps you to look at one in relation to the other, right? But whereas a dialogic approach is an approach which allows you to break the binary and, and make it possible for you to talk about, right, intersectionalities. So two very important approaches which I think, right, literature, right, can bring to this panel, okay, is our questions of intersectionality and questions of the dialogic, right, which allow gender and gender theory, and gender, approaches to gender to go beyond the binary to other aspects of, identity. So because essentially gender, rights or gender equality or whatever you might like to call it, right? It's basically a human right. I think both the panelists before me have agreed upon this, right? Because these are human rights. And when we say, women need jobs, or when we say trans men and women need, an inclusive space, they need to be, accepted by society, right? And when we say that laws need to, translate into an emerging social consciousness that is more inclusive, what are we talking about? We are basically talking about human rights and the fact that all of us need to have equal access to human rights. Okay, it could be the freedom to, say for example, to rent an apartment in Bangalore, right? Which probably most of us, how many of us would be willing to give an apartment on rent to a trans person, for example? Right? How many of us are willing to acknowledge that trans people are begging on the streets because we are not ready to include them either in our educational institutions or in our employment spaces? Although these beginnings have started happening right across various companies in the private sector, right? And there is an increasing need for us, right, to acknowledge the fact that inclusivity does not mean, okay, patronizing somebody or saying, okay, you also, poor thing, you will also get these privileges, or let me extend my privileges to you. No, it is understanding the fact that, right, I am not anybody to give you, your privilege, right? But to understand that all of us have equal access to rights. The question is about rights. It's not about privileges, right? Because the minute you talk about privilege, privilege is invisible. In the sense that, like Dr. Ananya said, she was not aware of the fact that she was privileged until she stepped into a place where privileges were absent. So most of the time, people who are privileged do not know that they are privileged, right? So the approach to the whole question of gender equality is through human rights, okay? Having said that, I thought I will talk to you briefly about 2 or 3 important writers whom you could look up, right? Contemporary writers. For example, one of the ways in which we can deconstruct, the stereotypical notion of gender, or to open up discourses of gender to masculinities and femininities equally, is to go back to the historicity of the myth of gender, for example. So the idea that that woman, right, is a myth is something that a lot of writers question today, because we are looking at revisionist mythology, right? So you see that there are any number of writers who are devising mythologies, who are revisioning mythologies. I would not like to talk about Ashok Banker or Devdutt Patnaik here, but I would like to call your attention to a very not very well known but equally prominent feminist writer of revisionist mythology. Her name is Volga. She's Pupuri Lalita in Telugu, that is her name. And, she has this very beautiful, collection of short stories based on the Ramayana. Okay. It is called The Liberation of Sita. If you have the time, please look it up, right? And this is a text which allows Sita to get into a dialogue with all the minor characters of the Ramayana. And, to look at their experience of the Ramayana, their experience of being, either female or belonging to a Dalit, community, or say to the Asuras, as they were called. So for example, she has this very interesting, there is one story where she is in dialogue with Shurpanaka, right? And we never hear of Shurpanaka. We don't know what has happened to her after her nose is cut off and her ears are cut off, right? And we know from the text that her breasts are also cut off, which means that she can neither be eligible for marriage, nor can she, suckle a young child, right? Which means that to a large extent, right, that is the punishment she gets for, expressing, overtly her attraction towards, a Kshatriya, an Aryan, right? And that is the reason why you see, you have this dialogue between Sita and Shurpanaka. And you see that at the end of the day, both of them are exiled. Both of them, Sita for following Rama as the, very dutiful wife, right? And, Shurpanaka for, challenging her inferiority by expressing her, desire for another man who is an Aryan, right, from a different race. And she being the sister of an Asura herself, a Dravidian. Okay. So the whole politics of war, the whole politics of why women are made victims of war and why the wars are all blamed on women, for example, is something that, she repeatedly questions, right? So you have heard of Helen of Troy being, blamed for the Trojan War. You've heard of Draupadi being blamed for the Kurukshetra War. And then, of course, Sita for the Lankan War. So the question that Volga is asking is, how long will you keep blaming women for all the, hegemonic decisions of war, of conflict, right, of racial discrimination that you continue to practice? So this is a very important space, right? So, dialogues with Ahalya, dialogues with, Manthara, right, dialogues with Shurpanaka, dialogues with so many other minor characters. And this is something that, is happening, right, in the Indian, literary field. It's something that all of us have to sit up and acknowledge. And the other text that I wanted you to read is a text, which again looks at, mythology, right? But from a different point of view. I'm talking about, I was talking about Volga, and now I'm going to talk about Olga, right? Olga Bramus, right? Olga Bramus is a Greek, lesbian feminist writer. And quite like Pupuri Lalita, Olga, she revisits the Greek mythologies, the Greek characters, right? Especially the women. She also revisits a lot of fairy tales, right? It could be Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast. It could be, a Little Red Riding Hood. Okay. So, I mean, there is this very interesting poem, right, which I would like to talk to you about, right? It's the story, it's the revisionist story in poetic form of the journey that Little Red Riding Hood takes from her mother's house to her grandmother's house. Okay. And, she says, "Mother, you asked me not to smell the flowers. You asked me not to go behind the bushes. You asked me to walk on the straight path. But you know what I did? I smelled the flowers on the way, and I opened my basket with other girls who were going to the grandmother's house," right? So this is a text which questions the straight road that women have to take back to the grandmother's house, right? On the one hand. And on the other hand, right, she begins by, saying, "Mother, architect of my soul, architect of my body. I wish I had a daughter who could come out of me like, I did out of your body," right? Stretching a wishbone. Okay. So the fact that she is a lesbian and the fact that she does not biologically want to be a mother, but the fact that she celebrates this consciousness of women, this collective of women, right? So her grandmother, her mother, and herself, and the fact that she does not have a daughter to carry on this tradition of women. Okay, so this is a very different approach to a very classical, popular myth, right, which is the myth of Red Riding Hood, because fairy tales are the ones that give us our notion of femininity, right? So I talked to you about, South of Forgiveness. That is a very interesting text which allows you to look at rape from a man's point of view, which is something that we don't do, for example. Similarly, you could look at texts like Shyam Silvudurai's The Funny Boy. Shyam Silvudurai is a Sri Lankan writer, diasporic Sri Lankan Canadian writer, right? And he was in his childhood, he had witnessed the conflict between the Sinhalese and the Tamils in Sri Lanka and the civil war that ensued in Sri Lanka, right? And that was the same time that he came out as, he realized that he's attracted to men and he came out as gay, right? And he came out of the closet, and at the same time, he emigrated to Canada, right? And he's an important writer who allows you to look at sexuality through the lens of nationality, nationalism, diasporic consciousness. Okay. So, I mean, when we look at a text which is non-heteronormative, it is not necessary that we have to look at it in terms of something very, we tend to look at sexuality, right, as something that has to do with a certain, intimacy or intimate practice. And we reduce all, such texts to, the act of, one act of desire or the act of bodily desire, right? But what you need to realize is most of, non-heteronormative fiction is about identity. It's about the intersectionality of identity with race quite as much as it is, right, for a lot of so-called straight writers, okay? So it's important for you to understand that when you're reading queer texts, you're not reading them just because it is about one man getting attracted to another man. Rather, it is a very important aspect of understanding the intersectionality of gender with other aspects of one's identity. Okay, so and I'm extremely sorry, and I don't think in 20-25 minutes I can cover the entire spectrum of what literature makes it possible for you to do, because literature questions a lot of the historicity of gender that we are used to. Literature questions a lot of the binaries that we are so used to in the external outside world, right? And literature makes it possible for you to break through the discourses and open up the discourses to various narratives of identity and identity formation. Okay, so one of the ways in which you can probably become more sensitive to the gender spectrum is to start reading, because most of you are from professional studies, and I'm sure you have quite a few teachers on your board, right? I don't want to name names. I don't know whether they would like it, but I'm sure there are people on your in your department, especially in the English department and other departments, who can introduce you to literature which can sensitize you to inclusivity. Okay, so I rest my case here. I hope I haven't taken too much of time. I did have a poem by Kalki. If I have the time, I will read it out. What would you what about Dr. Priya? Would you like to give me some time to read out Kalki's poem? Do we have the time?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello?
Yes, yes, yes. Audible.
Okay. Sorry, you're not very audible. Yeah.
Ma'am, please go ahead, ma'am.
Right. Okay, yeah. I want you to look at, thank you so much. I want you to look at this poem precisely because it captures the intersectionality of gender that I'm talking about. So Kalki is a trans, what you would call as a hijra, right? A male to female transgender person. Okay. So, I mean, make sure that whenever you use the term transgender, please use it with right male, female, person or community or people. Don't use the term transgenders. It is actually I was corrected by one of the members of the community, right? Basically I was told please do not use the term transgender as a noun, because that is not what it is. Okay, so you have to qualify the term transgender with another noun always. Please keep this in mind. Okay, so Kalki is a trans male to female. She is to a large extent you could call her the one of the most vocal hijras of India, who has represented the hijras in India at the UN. She is also part of film and media, and she is one of those few trans people in India who are privileged to have had a education and a steady career and access to the public media, which a lot of hijras do not have. So I mean, it wouldn't be wrong if I say that she's to a large extent an ambassador for the hijras, especially in India. So she has this very beautiful poem. It's called Phallus I Cut. Okay, so you know that most of the hijras have to undergo what they call as nirvana, which is a surgery. Right now, it is a surgery. It is done with anesthetics. For years, it was done without that. So basically, a male, right, who identifies himself, herself as hijra, has to remove the phallus, which is the the male organ. Okay, so phallus has a very different definition. Actually, it is more the symbolic gender that is attributed to the male body, the body that is identified as male, actually, right? And that is why we use the term phallus, right? Of course, you know what the anatomical word for phallus is. I don't have to mention it here, right? So so that is the reason why the term phallus is used here, because she is not only removing a part of her body, right, surgically, she is also giving up an identity which has been enforced on her because of that part of her body. Right. So this is called nirvana in the hijra community, and it is an operation which allows you to let go of the male organ so that you can embrace your femininity very freely. Okay. And in most cases, it is compulsory. If you want to belong to the community, you will have to be, able to undergo this operation. Okay. So at that point of time, when she underwent this operation, right, she wrote this very beautiful poem. It has been translated by Professor N. Elengo from Tamil to English. Okay, let me read it. And I want you to look at the questions of gender, sexuality, and the basic question that she brings to the biological conditioning of sex, that sex is something biological, is something that, you're able to question. Okay. So sex is biologically determined. There is a difference between saying sex is biological and that you're born into a certain sex, and saying that sex is biologically determined. All of our sexes are biologically determined. We are not born into any sex. We are born into biological matter. We are born as biological matter, which is identified as either of the two sexes. Okay. So maybe some other time, if I have the time to talk about it, maybe we can do that. But let me share Kalki's text here. Oh, now I'm able to share my slides also. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I finished whatever I had to say. So let me look at this. Let me do a quick reading of this very beautiful poem, right? I think you're all able to see the text now. Yeah. Okay. Phallus. Yeah, I cut by Kalki Subramaniam. No transcendental yoga I performed to transform myself into a woman. I cut my phallus, soiled in blood, and transcending death, I became a woman. Oh, you do not have ovary, woman thou art not, said you. Well, lo behold, as thou hast severed thy manhood, thou art now a desolate tree with decayed barks. Thou have dug the grave of thy own lineage. Live thou may till thy roots last. The earth that bears thee shall give up one day, as thou have not planted thy branches below, said you. Well, I do not want that ovary to carry your excretions of caste and religious fanaticism. And I do not want in my ovary the gestation of those seeds to grow into a tyrannous tree. Many a woman, as she carried the seeds of your discriminations, made her ovary your lavatory. Luckily, I am not a woman by birth, and that you refuse to accept me as one is in fact my real emancipation. I do not recite the gynogrammar you have crafted. Call me an error of nature. Call me what you will. I know it myself for sure. Who I am at any given hour. Renouncing religion, casting away caste, united as the rejected. Can you live this life we live? Can you become a mother without carrying a womb? Can you become a daughter without sucking at your mother's breast? I can. Cut the phallus of your chauvinism, and then you will know who you are. And then, and only then, you tell me. Okay? So I'll stop sharing this text. I think this is a very brilliant illustration of, right, the possibility that, any text on gender can open up for conversations across the gender spectrum, right? So this is one poem where you see most of your hegemonic notions of gender, sex, caste, religion, right? And of course, chauvinism and patriarchy are all questioned at one go, right? And all of them are, they fall down in one fell swoop, actually, literally, right? Which means that, who is a woman? A woman is a myth, right? And when you say a hijra is not a woman, a natural biological woman, right? You are actually attributing or accepting, you are accepting the fact that women are constituted in certain ways, and you're not ready to constitute the hijra body in a similar kind of femininity that you recognize with femininity. But the idea that gender is an act of recognition, that you're not born into a certain gender, right? That you become a gender, as very rightly, Simone de Beauvoir pointed out when she said, one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman, right? That is true of all genders. It's true of men. It's true of, a hijra trans male to female is more obviously showing you how gender is constituted. And that is very disturbing to you. But trust me, that is how all our genders are constituted. Right? So when the hijra wears a sari, it seems very inappropriate. But when I wear a sari every day, that's precisely what I'm doing. I'm performing my femininity. Okay. So if you have the time, read as much as you can, pick up books that talk about the intersectionality of gender, right? Read books on caste, on nationalism, right? Read writers like Mahashweta Devi or of course, Volga is there. Anytime you want to pick up something easy to read, translated, you can also pick up a lot of, diasporic fiction, which is queer. You can pick up feminist writers who are talking about very different questions. Of course, you will not see them using the label feminism, right? But it's interesting to see how gender in India is not right? The radical expressivist feminism that we often attribute to women's equality to men, right, in the first world, but it comes from, and it goes back to the intersectionality of gender with all other identity markers. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sushma, for specifying the role of literature in teaching all of us to view gender from an intersectional lens, especially in the current climate that our country is in. That is very important. And for also linking it to what Dr. Sapna was mentioning about our laws and rights and our relationship with formal institutions, as well as with Dr. Ananya's inputs on the gender spectrum from a psychological perspective. So yeah, moving on, I would now like to invite Professor Ruchira Datta, who's working as an assistant professor of English at the School of Performing Arts and Indic Studies at Reva University, Bangalore. She's closely related to Christ University as well, being an alumnus who completed her MPhil degree here and is also pursuing her PhD here. Her areas of interest are gender and food studies, and her MPhil dissertation explored the idea of food as a private language in culinary narratives. Her other areas of interest include post-colonial literature and post-humanism. Over to you, ma'am.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for having me. This is a very nice opportunity to talk about gender. More importantly, to talk about my work to a large extent, and I never like to give up an opportunity to talk either about gender or about my work. I think I will start.
Shreya, ma'am?
Yes.
Turn on your video, ma'am.
Sorry, I thought I did. Can you see me now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. Right, okay. Like I said, I think I will start off by looking at, by talking about the things I wanted to talk about. But I think I would like to make two disclaimers. One, when I talk about gender inclusivity or exclusivity, I'm going to largely look at women being included or excluded from spaces in general. I have a few examples from the Indian context, but not all my examples are from the Indian context. That's number one. Number two, mine might sound very different from the kind of arguments that we have been looking at. We looked at law. We looked at it from a very personal and psychosocial and psychological perspective. We also looked at it from the perspective of literature. While mine is grounded in literature, I think mine is also very prevalent in everyday life, but it is something that we see, but probably do not recognize as a site of inclusion, or as an example of inclusion or exclusion. So what I want to look at is actually the relationship between women and food, and how that becomes a means for women, that has served as a means for women to be included and excluded from spaces, or more specifically, how food plays a very important role in including and excluding women from different places, different spaces. So this is what within the larger discipline of food studies we call as the politics of food, which can be used to study the relationship, of course, between food and gender, food and women. I, for one, will focus, as of now, I will focus on the relationship between food and women rather than food and gender by and large. Sushma Ma'am was talking about, diasporic writers, diasporic queer writers who talk about their experiences. They also talk a lot about food, but I haven't included any examples right now as of yet. So I will largely talk about three things. So then to just give you an idea of what it is that I will talk about, three things. Number one is how historically women have been excluded from the public realm, which if you have a basic idea of the feminist movement, you would know what I'm talking about. The second thing I will talk about is I would look at what feminists refer to as a fresh wave of exclusion of women that happened with the rise of capitalism in post-World War II America. And finally, I would look at how the idea of being included or excluded from spaces have also oppressed and liberated women, enabling women to have oppressed and enabled women to sort of assert themselves or to articulate themselves within spheres that they have wanted to inhabit. So with that, let me just begin. So I will, of course, I will begin by the historical idea that I wanted to talk about. So historically, women have been removed from public spaces and pushed into the domestic sphere. And while feminists have always talked about, or feminists have often talked about the inclusion of women into various public forums, I will specifically look at the inclusion of women into the domestic kitchen, which simultaneously has resulted in their exclusion from the public kitchen. Western societies have justified this form of domesticity, this exclusion of women from the public spaces, from the public kitchen, by attributing it to the original sin, which, of course, if you are familiar with the Bible, you would know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Eve's eating of the apple from the tree of knowledge, which, of course, resulted in the fall of mankind, fall of man. And it also resulted in Eve being punished with servitude in the kitchen. Irrespective of how Western societies justify this reasoning, the truth remains that the truth remains that even in the 21st century, when we talk about the domestic space of the kitchen, the image of a woman within that kitchen is far more common than the image of a man within occupying such a space. In comparison to that, when we talk about a chef, when we talk about the public kitchen and we talk about a chef, the image that it bears is that of a man occupying that public space. There has been a study. It's a recent study. It looks at and it's not something that looks at third world countries and the difference between the public and the private realm in third world countries, because there's of course always the assertion that the first world countries are far better off culturally, financially, economically. They're far superior than us. But the study that I'm referring to is a study of the differentiation between the public and private kitchen in America. It's actually the study of the American channel Food Network, which is a very popular food channel on American television, which talks about how this particular food channel and the food shows on this channel perpetuate notions of women as the domestic cook and men as the professional chef, even in this 21st century. The research scholar talks about how, through the use of camera movement, through the use of costume, through the use of lighting, when a food show is hosted by a woman, this show, the woman is expected to be dressed in a casual. She's expected to, she could be a professional, she could be a professional chef, but she rarely talks about, in fact, the language that the scholar uses is the women never talk about their professional career. Instead, they come across as these homely women, homely mothers, grandmothers, welcoming their audience into her kitchen to talk about food, to necessarily prepare food for friends and family, and at the same time discussing various tips with their largely women audience about how to work on home improvement projects. While this is how shows hosted by female shows with female hosts are depicted, when you have food shows on Food Network hosted by men, these shows look at male hosts either as scientists or as chefs or as athletes or as entertainers. In other words, the men hosts always have the opportunity or share the privilege, if I may use that term in this context, share the privilege of asserting their professional culinary authority with their viewers, with their audience. In this way, the scholar talks about how even in the 21st century, a food prepared at home is rarely associated with notions of aesthetic, notions of art. Um, while the same dish, which is a same dish prepared at a restaurant, might be perceived as a part of a fine dining experience, which in a way becomes a means through which women are not only excluded from the public realm, but also their cooking is excluded from being in the same line as art, a privilege that male chefs often enjoy. To talk about the Indian context and this distinction between uh, the domestic kitchen and the public kitchen, one of the best examples that I can think of is what happened in Bengal during the rise of the nationalist movement in Bengal. That is, I'm talking about the nationalist movement and following the independence and all of that. As a precursor to the independence and all of that. So the nationalist movement in Bengal was interpreted in terms of food as well. Prior to the rise of the nationalist movement, the Bengali household consumed food which which borrowed or often included elements that had become a part of the Bengali cuisine, that had become a part of the Bengali households on account of the colonial rule. Something, for instance, something as simple as, let's say, biscuits and bread, which became a part of, which of course now is a very common part of our household, but it came to us during or through colonization. But with the rise of the nationalist movement, a very conscious attempt was made within the upper middle class and middle class Bengali household to delineate themselves from such colonial associations, from such English associations. They specifically wanted to go back and explore regional cuisine. There was a return to what is specifically considered as Bengali food or Bengali cuisine. And the Bhadralok society in Bengal, which is, of course, a reference to the Bengali intelligentsia, which, of course, again is extremely male in its existence and appearance. The Bengali intelligentsia believed that this, by asking or expecting women within their household, or the Bhadro Mohila of the Bengali household, to prepare dishes that were regional rather than English in its by its association, they were trying to include the women into the nationalist movement. That was the justification given for their delineation from the previously common ways of eating in Bengal during the early rise of the nationalist movement in Bengal. So this constant idea of domesticating women and attributing her to the domestic spaces was an idea that was sort of saw a change or a respite during the World War, a time when many women, especially within the Western context, I'm again going back to the Western context, many women during the Western context, during the World War, in the Western context during World War II especially, worked outside of their home as nurses, as assistants, helping the men who were actively participating, or assisting the men who were actively participating in the war. However, as one of the very famous works by a food studies scholar, I will read out the name of the text because I find the name very relevant. The text is, her essay is termed "I Guarantee From Betty Crocker to Woman in the Kitchen." The title sort of talks about a return of the woman to the kitchen. And in this essay, in this particular article, she talks about how post World War II, American society saw a need to re-domesticate women. Once women had served outside of their homes, once they had worked outside of their home, women very much wanted to continue that position. Women very much wanted to continue working outside of their home. But the American society thought that in order for the society to heal, to recover from what was the disaster, which is World War II, to recover from the disaster of World War II, what American society needed was balance. What they needed was going back to how things were when going back to how things were before the war. And the best way to do that was to re-domesticate women. I emphasize on the term re-domesticate. The best way to do that was to re-domesticate women. The justification was that the idea that the presumed notion that women are somehow born nurturers makes them a perfect fit to go back, makes them a perfect fit to nurture the men and the family back to health by cooking and serving homemade meals. With this notion, American society restructured itself and sent women back to the kitchen. But what the essay actually highlights for us is that while on the one hand, the justification for redomesticating women was that the American society needed to heal. On the other hand, this was also the time of the rise of the capitalist economy, the capitalist American society that we today see. It was also the rise of the commercialized food market, commercialized. It was the rise of a food production system, a commercialized food production system, and so at this point in history, American society started providing women with packaged food. And this packaged food, as was the slogan of Betty. So Betty Crocker is actually a food company. They made pancake mixes. They were very famous for their cake mixes and pancake mixes. They still do exist. Ann Pillsbury and Betty Crocker were two competitors, food companies, food producers who produce packaged food. And these two companies, they talked about, so they promised to reduce women's time in the kitchen, because these women were just coming back. These women were also rehabilitating themselves and refamiliarizing themselves with the kitchen. So these companies, these corporate food industry, these corporate companies, they promised women packaged convenience that was meant to reduce women's time in the kitchen. But one of the things that the essays talks about is how you are able to, you think about reducing her time in the kitchen, but you never think of a kitchen without the woman, right? How there is no re-envisioning of the kitchen in this post-World War II era, after women have proved that they can work outside of their household and they're quite efficient when they're outside. How you re-envision the kitchen as a space for the woman. So the argument goes that while the corporate food industry promised to reduce cooking time and offered women packaged convenience, it continued to rely on women's domestic labor to turn that packaged food into a homely meal, a homely meal that would magically transform the family into being a happy family. In fact, some scholars go so far as to say that modern technological modern culinary technological advancements, which would include things like the mixer grinder, which would include things like toasters, electric kettles, and maybe even the modular kitchen, were all created with the assumption that homemaking is women's most rewarding way of life. In fact, if you ever feel like finding out what this inclusion and exclusion I'm constantly talking about and why this has anything to do with food, just Google advertisements, food related advertisements or culinary gadgets related advertisements of 1950s, 1960s America, that constantly iterated and reiterated the idea that a woman belongs in the kitchen and she is very happy there, thereby again removing women from the public realm and putting her back into the historic space of the kitchen. And I use the word historic intentionally in this context. So in this way, societies have constantly defined and redefined the role of women, providing role of women as one who provides domestic comfort, or who's expected to provide domestic comfort, thus tying women to the domestic realm and excluding her from the public one. Now, having said that, one of the things that as feminists we should also, especially, and Sushma ma'am was somewhat talking about that even when I studied feminism, my understanding of feminism has been extremely Western. The text we read were largely Western feminist theorists and writers, but now years couple of years later, as someone who's been a feminist research scholar for quite some time now, quite aware of the fact that not all the theorists that you read in the Western context can be applied to the Indian scenario. So keeping that in mind, or to the third world scenario. So keeping that in mind, I would like to talk about how, when you talk about women being included within the domestic space and therefore necessarily excluded from the public realm, it is not necessary that it has always resulted in a sense of subjugation, a sense of oppression in women. In fact, in many instances, there are feminist, third world feminists as well as Western feminists who have argued that in their own way, despite their historic exclusion from the public realm, in their own way, women have often used the domestic space of the kitchen to assert their sense of identity, to assert their sense of self. And one of the examples that I would like to talk about in this context is from the movie Fire. This is Deepa Mehta's movie Fire, 1996 movie Fire. So the movie is perceived to be very controversial because it explores same-sex love and same-sex desire between the two female protagonists of the movie. So in one of the most important scenes from the movie, Radha, played by Shabana Azmi, and Sita, played by Nandita Das, talk about the various benefits of spices. When Radha actually goes on to inform Sita that pepper provides strength and is therefore often given to new grooms, to which Sita very playfully asks Radha, and what is provided to new brides? Radha says that they provide new brides with cardamom, which provides freshness of breath, and very playfully pops a cardamom in Sita's mouth. Now, this entire scene, for me, and for feminists who have interpreted this scene as a scene of empowerment and as a scene of articulation of same-sex desire, the entire scene occurs within the kitchen space. It's shot in the kitchen where these two women are situated. They are they're in the kitchen, away from the prying eyes of the patriarchal society, and under the guise of providing for their family, because these two women are married to the two brothers in the family. So that's why they're both in the same kitchen, under the guise of providing food for their family members. They find the space as a space of empowerment, right? Under the guise of providing for the family, they're able to assert or express their love for one another. Apart from this, there is a more quantitative example of how the kitchen becomes a space for women to assert their sense of self. And the quantitative example is of the fact that there are many more women writers who choose to write about their experiences of the kitchen, not just in terms of book, but you would be surprised the number of female food bloggers who talk about their experiences of food on blogs, which in itself is very interesting, because by writing about their personal experiences with food, women sort of thrust themselves into the public realm of writing, a space which has conventionally been a space from which women have been conventionally excluded. Consequently, when we talk about women asserting themselves, there's also, of course, the expression of women being oppressed and forcefully pushed into the kitchen. And one of the popular examples of this that I could think of was, of the fairy tale Cinderella, right? because I mean, if you look at her name, it comes from her being constantly pushed into the kitchen and into away from the eyes of the rest of the world, right? In fact, if you are familiar with the fairy tale, you know that even when the prince arrives to check uh, uh, to whom the shoe belongs, she is very carefully tucked away into the kitchen and provided with strict instructions by her stepmother not to come out of that space. But I mean, it's a fairy tale, it's fiction, and she's eventually discovered, and the rest is a Disney movie, which I'm sure all of us have seen at some point or the other. So in conclusion, I think what I would like to conclude now by pointing out that um, when we talk about inclusion and exclusion, we did talk about laws, and we did talk about the third gender, and we spoke about inclusion and exclusion. Sushma ma'am was again talking about literature, and I mean, both of us are from the field of literature, and when we talk about literature, I mean, historically, feminist literature and women's writing have articulated and talked about how women have been categorically removed from the literary scene. So, and all of these we know of, all of this we read about. But one of the things that I have always uh, felt as a scholar of both food and gender studies is that one of the things that is very prominent, it's right in front of us, but we generally don't talk about it, is how women um, are included and excluded from the included into the domestic kitchen, but excluded from the public kitchen. Not to mention how the inclusion of women into the domestic space, just the very act of domesticity is still something that there are many Marxist feminists who have talked about the need to pay women for their unpaid domestic labor, cooking being one very important such domestic labor. And to include, and there's this very interesting article, which of course looks at which tends to look at how if we start including, and this is again in the Indian context, and it talks about how if we start including women's unpaid labor into India's GDP will go up by about 27%. Right? So when we talk about inclusion, I think this is also one form of inclusion that we should look at, or we should talk about, especially when talking about women. Right? So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for being patient. I know it's almost time, so thank you. Over to you, Subiksha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ruchira ma'am, for bringing out this complex relationship between women and food in both the domestic and public spaces, and where on one hand, women can exercise some agency in the domestic space, but on the other, it can be confining as well. And I guess a lot of us could relate that to what it's been like in the past 1.5 years under quarantine and lockdown because of COVID, where several studies showed how women had to assume even more domestic labor on their end, despite having everyone at home. So yeah, that's something that we can draw from this. Priya ma'am, is it okay if we can take a couple of questions now to the panelists?
Yeah, of course, Sureksha. I just have one announcement to make. I'll just do that. The
Sure.
feedback link for the students has been enabled. The students who are watching it on YouTube, the feedback link has been enabled for you. You can start filling it up. Thank you. You can continue, Sureksha.
Thank you, ma'am. So the first question actually came from our Q&A box, and this is from Professor Vishal Choradia, and he addressed it to Dr. Sapna. So this was regarding the judgment that you brought out, ma'am, about the triple talaq and the Sabrimala cases. Vishal sir wants to know that the majority of judgments of the Supreme Court did not rule in the instant triple talaq and Sabrimala cases necessarily on the grounds of gender equality, but that these practices are not essential to the respective religions. So he, I guess, wants you to comment on that angle. Was it really from a lens of gender, or was the religious tradition involved in that judgment?
Yeah, see, thank you for this question. I think this is a very relevant question, Vishal. Now, the reason why this is so very important for gender equality is because, see, when you're looking at triple talaq, even though triple talaq was about a religious provision, even though it was about a religious rule that was being made unconstitutional, or say, for example, the Shabrimala case where entry into the temple for a woman was said to be unconstitutional. These are the most important gender equality rulings by the Supreme Court. And the reason why we say that is because now this is not just about this is not just about one person. It is not about one individual being privatized into the whole thing. It is not about something which just one person faces, and then another person in the similarly situated situation does not have to follow the same procedure. Now these are very fundamental and important points for gender equality, because what affected triple talaq, what affected talaq e bidat was not just for that one woman. It was not something that was personally to her, but it was for a class of women who belonged to that community. So if you are a Hindu, you did not have to face that. If you were a Christian, you did not have to face that. But you face that only because you are a woman and you are of that religion. So that is where the gender justice comes from. And even the Shabrimala case also, it was not just about one woman who was not allowed, but it was against a class. It was against a class, it was against a gender. And that's the reason why we call it very important cases of gender equality and gender justice in the meanwhile.
Sorry, I was muted. So I had one question. So I'm sure a lot of the students watching this are at the cusp of beginning their careers. And this question is to all the panelists. You can feel free to pitch in. So we've all heard of the problem of the glass ceiling, that yes, there are many laws that protect women and encourage women's participation in the workforce. But if we look at the statistics, women in senior leadership positions globally are only about 20%. Give or take. And that in India, there's a major pay gap of about 19% between men and women. And this is not even including other minority genders like transgender people. So what are your thoughts on how the glass ceiling can be broached, and what are the barriers that are limiting gender minorities from attaining that level of inclusivity? Sure, ma'am. You can take it forward.
Because you began something with loss. I was just I could not resist the temptation. So of course absolutely, we totally understand. Even when we say women in the boardroom, and we use big words like that. Despite the loss, we still have this thing about glass ceiling. We still face this problem that women in the leadership, women in the boardroom, independent directors in the organizations, in the companies, are much less. And this is this whole concept and a phenomenon which is called leaking pipeline syndrome. So leaking pipeline syndrome refers to, you have a good number of women at the entry level, but by the time that they get their promotions and come, slowly you see that there's a leak that happens. They just seep away, and they just kind of go away into oblivion. Now there are so many reasons for this, and one important reason, of course, is about this concept of inclusivity. That is precisely what I was telling when I began. It is not sufficient that you say that I have women in my organization, but you also need to have environment which says that I'm going to support a woman in the organization. Now, say for example, if you have an organization, if you have a work culture which demands a lot of travel, how many of the organizations are ready to accept the soon-to-be mothers? How many of them are ready to accept? And how many at the time of the recruitment, when they see a woman who's about 23, and if she says that she's just married, how many will be bold enough and courageous enough to say that she has the same qualification as another person, or she has better qualification, so therefore let us absorb her into the organization? It definitely creeps into the recruiters who feel that now she's married, she's going to have a child, and then she's going to apply for maternity leave once again. Then what am I going to do? How am I going to replace? I mean, even in fact, being on the external committee of many of the sexual harassment committees also, I have seen many times gender discrimination like that do happen, and biases like that creep in. Now, to understand how this can be remedied, I think the organizations will have to make it as a culture. The organizations will need to understand it is not just a concept of fairness, but like the IMF says, as the World Bank itself says, now it is an economic no-brainer if you don't have inclusivity. Now, if you don't give that kind of enough environment to women, you're not going to have economic progress in your organization. So that is something that the organization will have to work very.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So we have one more question from Dr. Buddha Anuradha, ma'am, and she wants to know if we're going to get the 1/3, the 33% representation of women elected representatives in our parliament, and whether it is required, and what your view on that is. And again, open to all panelists, ma'am. Samna ma'am, you can also take this.
I think that's more, sorry, Sapna, I think it's more in your line. Although that was my question to you as well. I thought I'll talk to you probably later because we didn't have a lot of time. So that's the whole point, right? Although it's on paper, we don't have that kind of representation of women. So why do you think that happens?
Yeah, see, I mean, in fact, even in the panchayat, where I have done a lot of this grassroots level consultancies and gender capacity building also, many times it so happens that in the panchayat also they have this, women reservations. Now, there are women, but what happens is that it is actually not them who are leading it, or it is not them who are leading, but it is rather, it is their husbands who are actually holding the chain and who are holding the leash. Now, why this representation from women is less is because I have a feeling maybe women have less role models when they look at places like this. I mean, this is purely my perspective, and they always feel that getting into these kinds of leadership positions, whether they would be in a position to do that. But somewhere I feel that women require more role models to get into the leadership positions. And like again, getting back into this whole inclusivity thing, it is not sufficient that we have women in those positions, or we make reservations, or we say that the company law has been changed, or the SEBI amendment has come about. What is also required is that you make those changes that is requisite. Now, if you read Lean It, which is a book by Sheryl Sandberg. Now, she says in that Lean In book that it is very important that if you need to have inclusivity, you need to have that kind of environment to bring in that. More women in the leadership is definitely going to help in that direction. And I think, we just need to encourage and promote that.
Thank you, ma'am. So my next question, I guess, might be more relevant to Dr. Shushma and Professor Ruchira. And this is concerning representation in media. So a lot of us draw of our experiences and our understanding of gender and feminism from media. So what, in your opinion, is considered good representation versus just tokenization and tokenization of a community on screen or in literature?
Okay, may I go first?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah. So, there is one thing that we have been talking about, right? That we all belong to an equal society. We need to be equal. I mean, see, that is the reason why a lot of, understanding of ideology becomes important. Okay. So let me begin from a very philosophical point of view. Okay. As long as we are all different human beings, there is always the politics of representation. Okay. So what I'm saying is, there is always the politics of language, for example. So I might, for example, escape gender in other ways, but language can, gender me, represent me in certain ways. Okay. So, in fact, it is like, how do I put this across to you? It's like living, fish living in water. As long as we are alive, we are symbolic beings and we cannot escape the gamut of representations. Okay. So that is the reason why, although, on paper, in law, in so many different political ways, equality is ensured to all of us. The idea of representation is something that is socially conditioned, right? Because we are all symbolic beings, right? So there is going to be, for example, there is a very thin line between objectification of women and that sense of sexual emancipation or liberty that women feel, right, with their bodies, right? So if you're going to look at an item number, right, on the screen, so what is it actually? Is it objectification, or does it give women the freedom to express their bodies openly? Because a lot of actors do subscribe to that, right? So they say, women should not hesitate, right? Or there's a very thin line. So it's a very difficult so sometimes what happens is, see, we are talking about inclusivity, right? There are a lot of companies who are practicing this tokenism actually in the private sector, right? So jobs, because they want to market their company as inclusive, right? So it becomes very difficult to say what is tokenism and what is, a very authentic representation in a very inclusive way. So it's a little diabolical in that sense, right? And advertising as we know it, films as we know them, right? They actually they, what do you say, they tap on this potential, right? They use it to the maximum extent possible, right? So either way, I see this sometimes as very problematic, right? So when we say that the aesthetics of the body of say a female body is largely through the male gaze, then the question that filmmakers ask, women especially, right, these are feminists who are into filmmaking, the questions that they have asked is there a feminine aesthetic? If a woman were to imagine a woman's body, what would it look like, for example? Because you are so steeped in the politics of representation, in the language of representation, like fish in water, right? It becomes very difficult to get out of that. You understand what I'm saying? So, these are very, very philosophical questions, actually, and there are no easy answers to this. Yeah. Sorry if I made your question more complex.
No, I don't think there is a clear-cut answer to any of this. So
Yeah.
But thank you. Did shed a lot of light on it. And does anyone else have an opinion on this, or before I move on to my last question? But
Okay, shall I go ahead?
sure, ma'am. Yeah.
Right. So when I was thinking about this question, I think there are two aspects of it that I can think of. One is what Sushma already spoke about, the fact that the line between tokenism and objectification can sometimes get blurred or maybe even be slightly thin. Second, I think a lot depends upon we talk about this whole idea of empowerment. We talk about this idea of agency, right? So if the woman feels that for me, this is what I feel comfortable with, then I think to a certain extent, who are we to judge is what I think. For instance, I will give a very popular culture reference of this. If you're familiar with the Avengers movies, if you're familiar with the whole genre, and one of the things that these movies are praised because, oh my God, they have so many female superheroes, pat pat your back for having so many female superheroes.
Exactly.
But I don't know if you know this, but this is something Scarlett Johansson, who plays, she plays
Black Widow.
Black Widow, right? I keep getting confused between Black Widow and Scarlet Witch because they both have red hair. It's so confusing for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry. So she plays Black Widow, and she has said this again and again in her interviews, and in her press conferences, they ask superheroes, oh, what about your character? Tell me how it has grown. Your character, we see a dark side to your character this time. We see a white side and all sorts of sides to your characters. But the questions that Scarlett Johansson keep getting, even in forums such as Comic Con, which is a big deal for superhero fans, are about fashion, are about her body, are about things like, who did you enjoy working with more, this guy or that guy? And Scarlett Johansson has constantly spoken about she always has very sarcastic remarks to this, and I feel that you take a actor such as Scarlett Johansson, who's possibly one of the most popular Hollywood actresses of the time, and you look at how you look at the kind of roles she does for camera in movies. I mean, she's the Black Widow. Look at some of the amazing action sequences she has done, and but then cut to the real life. Look at how we go back to this whole notions of objectification, of looking at women in conventional sense. That when I look at Johansson, I'm going to ask her about her, about her clothing. She's been asked again and again about her costumes, her fashion statements, and all of that. So I think that again, the line is very thin, and sometimes we forget that just because it looks nice, it's not necessarily nice. So just because you have female superheroes, we do not necessarily live in a very empowered world, or we are not necessarily empowering women. And also in terms of the second point that I had made, in terms of what if it's the woman's choice, I think there's this other example that I can think of, which was said by a third world feminist writer, who talks about how if a woman wants to wear a hijab, then who is anybody else to question her? If it's her choice, if you're forcing her to wear it, then that's a completely different story. But if a woman decides to or wishes to wear hijab, that is completely on her, because many women who wear hijab have suggested or commented that it is a part of their identity, that they feel complete when they wear it. That's how they see themselves. So then who are we to judge? I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but these are...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you. And finally, from my side, I wanted to ask Dr. Ananya, and as a clinical psychologist, I was hoping you can probably shed some light on what I think is a misconception from my family circles and my friend circle, like in college or in education. A lot of times what we hear is that biologically, the brains of men and women and other genders are just wired differently. For example, men are more tuned to be analytical and aggressive and technology oriented, for example, and women are supposed to be docile and, caring and more emotional. And this is usually used as like weaponized to subject people into different roles in society again. So I wanted your expert perspective on how far this is true, if at all, and how is this misconception even so widespread in the first place?
Thank you for the question, Subiksha. So, like when you were saying only, I think you answered your question when you said that it is a misconception. Of course, there are many researchers, and when we do research, we find gender differences at many levels. So cognitive abilities, and like we actually, when we do a neuropsychological study and when we check, let's say we compare the cognitive capacities of male and female, lots of factors come into play. So we cannot say for sure, okay, men have this capacity more than women, because we need to take into the fact that the context is very important. What kind are we actually ensuring that they are getting similar, let's say, upbringing, similar exposure, similar, all everything, and they have a different genetic loading. So everything comes into play when we have to comment something as strong as that, okay, men have these abilities different from women. However, what probably is important to understand here is it is sometimes convenient to follow certain gender stereotypes also. And that's why, so like I think when Professor Ruchira was talking about that it's easier for us to visualize women in a kitchen because we are so used to doing that. So sometimes we feel that it is that the kind of role that they are more used to engaging in, and probably they are better at it. But we do know that most of the professional cooks are basically males. So what we probably need to understand is there is a difference between stereotypes and actual research-based evidence. And when we say research-based evidence, abilities are more, there are individual ability, like there are individual differences in ability. So instead of just boiling it down only to gender-based differences, we need to understand the individual, specifically what are the specific characteristics of the individual, abilities of the individual. So let's say somebody can sing well, so that is this individual ability, not that he's a male so he can sing well, or she's a female so she can sing well. Somebody can cook well, somebody can analyze well. So we know that men and women are being represented at every level in every area. So the abilities are basically when they get the equal kind of training, or they get equal kind of exposure, they are performing at every specific thing. So instead of limiting ourselves to misconceptions, probably we need to move forward and look at them as individuals with abilities rather than genders with limited abilities.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So yeah, those are all the questions from my end, and I've taken the questions that came to our Q&A box as well. And Priya ma'am, is there anything further that you would like to ask?
Yeah. Thank you, Sudaksha. Thank you so much. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I invite Senthil Kumar sir to propose the voter stand. And after the voter stand, we'll be taking a photograph. So I request you all to switch on your videos during that time. Thank you.
Yeah. Good evening to everyone. I take immense pleasure in proposing the vote of thanks. I thank all our panel members, Dr. Ananya Sinha, Dr. Sapna ma'am, Professor Ruchira Datta, Dr. Susma V. Murthy for spending their precious time and sharing their valuable ideas on the topic gender, inclusivity and exclusivity. I thank our moderator, Ms. Subiksa, for moderating and carrying out the session very smoothly. And I thank our Dean, Dr. Tommy sir, for his motivation, and our Director, Professor Biju Thomas sir, for his continual encouragement. I thank our HOD, Dr. Kavita ma'am, for her tremendous support and guidance, and she had given us in organizing the event. The last but not the least, I take great pleasure in thanking our students for their participation and making this session a grand success. Once again, I thank you all. Thank you so much.